The stagecoach rattled into Willow Creek, Wyoming, kicking up clouds of dust that settled on everything like a second skin. Amelia Foster pressed her face against the window, her breath fogging the glass as she searched the small collection of buildings that passed for a town. Her heart pounded in her chest, not from excitement but from fear. She had traveled 2,000 miles from Boston, leaving behind a scandal that had destroyed her family's name and her own future. The man waiting for her, Carrick Montgomery, had answered her advertisement, offering marriage and a new life in exchange for a wife who could keep a house and bear children. She had promised nothing more. She had nothing more to give. The stagecoach door opened, and the driver helped her down onto the dusty street. Her boots sank into the dirt, and for a moment, she stood frozen, clutching her small valise, her eyes darting from face to face. She saw rough men in worn coats, women in calico dresses, children who stared at her with open curiosity. She felt their eyes on her tear-stained cheeks, her disheveled hair, the fine dress that was now wrinkled and stained from the journey. She had cried the entire way from Cheyenne, unable to stop, unable to explain the grief that sat in her chest like a stone. She was ruined, and everyone who looked at her could see it. Then she saw him. He was standing apart from the crowd, leaning against a post with his arms crossed, a tall man with broad shoulders and a face weathered by sun and wind. He wore a simple wool coat and a wide-brimmed hat that shadowed his eyes. But even from a distance, she could see that he was watching her with an intensity that made her breath catch. He did not smile. He did not rush forward. He simply waited, as if he understood that she needed a moment to gather herself. She thought about all the letters they had exchanged, all the careful words about practical arrangements, about land and cattle, and the sensible nature of their agreement. None of those letters had prepared her for this. She walked toward him because there was nowhere else to go. Her legs felt weak, her hands trembling, and she could feel the tears threatening to spill over again. When she reached him, she stopped and looked up, and for the first time, she saw his face clearly. He was not handsome in the way Boston men were handsome. His jaw was too sharp. His nose had been broken at some point, and there were lines around his eyes that spoke of long days under a harsh sun. But his eyes, gray as a winter sky, held a gentleness that she had not expected. "Miss Foster," he said, and his voice was low, rough, like stones grinding together. She opened her mouth to speak, to offer the polite words she had rehearsed, but nothing came out. She stood there in the dust of Willow Creek, a woman who had crossed a continent to marry a stranger, and she could not say a single word. The silence stretched between them, and she felt the eyes of the town pressing down on her, waiting to see what would happen. She had expected him to be impatient, to demand explanations, to show the first signs of the disappointment that would surely follow. Instead, he stepped closer, and his voice, when he spoke, was so quiet that only she could hear. "You don't have to pretend with me." The words hit her like a wave, and something inside her cracked. She tried to hold it together, tried to be the composed, sensible woman she had promised to be. But the tears came anyway, hot and fast and unstoppable. And in front of everyone, she lost it. She expected him to step back, to look away, to show the embarrassment that everyone else in her life had shown when she could not hold herself together. Instead, he reached out and took her valise from her shaking hands, then offered his arm. "The wagon's this way," he said, as if women wept in the middle of dusty streets every day. She took his arm because she had no choice, because her legs would not hold her otherwise, and he led her through the crowd without looking at anyone, without acknowledging the whispers that followed them. He helped her onto the wagon seat, climbed up beside her, and with a flick of the reins, they were moving. She cried the whole way out of town, and he did not say a word. He did not need to. The ranch was an hour's ride from Willow Creek, a collection of weathered buildings nestled in a valley that caught the last light of the setting sun. By the time they arrived, Amelia had cried herself empty. She sat on the wagon seat, hollow and exhausted, watching the house grow larger as they approached. It was not a grand house, nothing like the townhouse in Boston where she had grown up, but it was solid, well-built, with a wide porch and smoke curling from the chimney. Carrick stopped the wagon in front of the house and climbed down, then came around to help her. His hands were rough on her waist as he lifted her down, and she felt the strength in them, the steadiness. He led her inside, and she found herself standing in a kitchen that was clean but spare, with a stove that still held the warmth of a fire and a table set for two. There was a vase of wildflowers in the center of the table, and she stared at them for a long moment, trying to understand why a man expecting a mail-order bride would put flowers on the table. "I didn't know what you'd like," he said from behind her, and there was something in his voice that sounded almost shy. "I figured flowers couldn't hurt." She turned to look at him, at this strange man who had not demanded explanations, had not turned away from her tears, had put flowers on the table for a woman he had never met. "Thank you," she whispered. He showed her to a small bedroom at the back of the house, a room that had clearly been prepared for her. The bed was made with clean sheets, a quilt folded at the foot, and there was a pitcher of water and a basin on the dresser. A simple dress made of practical calico, not the fine silk she was used to hung from a hook on the wall. "Mrs. Hendricks down the road made that," he said. "She figured you'd need something for every day." Amelia touched the fabric, feeling the roughness of it, and something tightened in her chest. She had left Boston with nothing but the clothes on her back and a valise of memories she wished she could forget. And here, in this stranger's house, someone had thought to make her a dress. She slept that night more deeply than she had slept in months, the exhaustion of the journey and the grief she had been carrying finally catching up with her. When she woke, the morning light was streaming through the window, and for a moment, she did not know where she was. Then she heard the sound of boots on the porch, the clatter of a bucket being set down, the low murmur of a man talking to his horses. She rose and dressed in the calico dress, which fit well enough, and found her way to the kitchen. Carrick was there, pouring coffee into 2 cups, and he looked up when she entered. "Morning," he said, pushing a cup toward her. "Sleep well?" She nodded, wrapping her hands around the warm cup, and for the first time in weeks, she felt something that was not grief. She felt safe. The days that followed fell into a rhythm. Carrick worked from dawn until dusk, tending to the cattle, mending fences, doing the 100 small tasks that kept a ranch alive. Amelia learned to cook on the wood stove, to draw water from the well, to sweep the floors and mend the clothes and make a home of a place that had been empty for too long. She did not talk about Boston, and he did not ask. They shared meals in the evenings, sitting across from each other at the table, and slowly, tentatively, they began to build something that was not quite a marriage, but was not nothing either. He told her about the ranch, about the cattle, about the neighbor who was always trying to cheat him. And she listened. One evening, as they sat on the porch, watching the sun set behind the mountains, Carrick asked her a question that she had been dreading. What happened in Boston? She stiffened, her hands tightening on the cup she was holding. She could feel the words pressing against her throat. The story she had told no one. The truth that had destroyed everything. "You don't have to tell me," he said quickly, and she could hear the regret in his voice. He stopped, shook his head. "Never mind." Amelia looked at him, at this man who had asked for nothing, who had given her a home and safety, and never once demanded the explanations he had every right to expect. "There was a man," she said, and the words came out like stones falling from her mouth. She told him everything. The handsome young man who had courted her, the promises he had made, the night she had believed him when he said they would marry. She told him about the scandal when he left her for another woman, about the whispers that followed her through the streets of Boston, about the father who had told her she was no longer his daughter. She told him about the advertisement she had answered in desperation, the letter she had written late at night when she had nothing left to lose. When she finished, she was shaking, and she could not look at him. She waited for the judgment, the disgust, the careful words about how she had brought it on herself. Instead, She felt his hand close over hers. "I'm sorry," he said, and his voice was rough. "I'm sorry that happened to you." She looked up, and his gray eyes were steady on hers, holding nothing but honesty. "You were hurt," he said. "You were betrayed. And you came all the way out here to marry a man you never met because you thought you had no other choice." He paused, and something shifted in his expression. "I want you to know that you have a choice now. This marriage doesn't have to be anything you don't want it to be. We can be partners, friends. Whatever you need." Amelia stared at him, and for the first time since she had stepped off that stagecoach, she did not feel like a burden. She felt like a person. The weeks turned into months, and the careful distance between them began to close. She learned to read the weather in the way the wind moved across the prairie, to ride alongside him when he checked the fences, to laugh at his dry humor when he complained about the stubbornness of his cattle. He learned the things that made her smile, the way she hummed when she cooked, the way she looked at the wildflowers that grew along the creek. They fell into something that was not love, not yet, but was the ground from which love grows. And then, one night in October, a storm came that changed everything. The wind howled across the valley, rattling the windows and shaking the house to its foundations. Amelia had never seen a prairie storm like this. The rain coming in sheets, the lightning splitting the sky, the thunder so close it felt like the world was ending. She was alone in the house when she heard the crash, and she ran to the window to see that a tree had fallen across the barn door. Carrick was out there, somewhere, and she did not think. She grabbed his coat from the hook and ran into the storm. She found him fighting to move the tree, his face streaked with rain, his hands bleeding. Without a word, she took hold of the other end and pulled. They got the tree moved, got the animals out, got back to the house soaked and shivering and laughing with the absurdity of it all. Carrick built up the fire while she made coffee, and when he came to stand beside her, dripping water on the floor, she did something she had never done before. She reached up and touched his face, her fingers tracing the line of his jaw, the scar she had noticed that first day. He went very still, and she saw something flicker in his eyes, something that looked like hope. "Amelia," he said, and her name in his mouth was like a prayer. She did not answer with words. She leaned forward and kissed him, and the world outside the window ceased to exist. After that night, everything changed. They moved from separate bedrooms to the same one, from careful distance to easy intimacy. She learned the warmth of him beside her in the cold Wyoming nights, the sound of his laughter when she burned the biscuits, the way he looked at her when he thought she was not watching, like she was something precious, something he could not quite believe was real. She had come to Wyoming expecting a marriage of convenience, a transaction that would give her a roof over her head in exchange for the work of her hands. She had not expected to find a man who looked at her and saw not her past, but her future. The spring brought new life to the valley and new life to Amelia. When she told Carrick she was carrying their child, he held her so tightly she could barely breathe, and when he let her go, she saw tears in his eyes. "I never thought I'd have this," he said, his voice rough. "I never thought I'd have you." She cupped his face in her hands and kissed him. And she thought about the woman who had stepped off the stagecoach with tear-stained cheeks and a shattered past. She thought about the man who had said, "You don't have to pretend with me." She thought about the words she had not known she was waiting to hear, the ones that had unlocked something in her she had thought was dead. She was not that woman anymore. The baby came in the autumn, a girl with her father's gray eyes and her mother's dark hair. Carrick held her in his arms, his face transformed by a wonder that made Amelia's heart ache with love. "She's beautiful," he whispered. Amelia reached out and touched her daughter's cheek, then reached for her husband's hand. "She is," she said. "She's everything." Carrick looked at her then, at the woman who had come to him broken and afraid, who had built a life with him out of nothing but honesty and trust. "I love you," he said, and the words were simple, unadorned, as solid as the ground beneath their feet. Amelia smiled, and it was the smile of a woman who had finally found what she had been looking for all along. "I know," she said. "I love you too." And in that small house on the Wyoming prairie, in the arms of the man who had seen her at her worst and loved her anyway, Amelia Amelia Montgomery, found what the girl in Boston had only dreamed of. She found a home